Peace, family. Y'all know who it is. It's Bakari Lumumba, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage for always betting on Black. We're back once again with another video, but before we get started, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button and make sure you tap that notification bell. So we're back with another video entitled, Put Some Respect on Dr. King's Name. So, I've noticed a troubling trend in the entertainment industry. As many of you know, I tend to stay in my lane, meaning I focus on politics, education, Black empowerment. However, I've noticed a troubling trend in which entertainers have made some negative comments about some of our greatest African ancestors. And when I say African, I mean that in a Pan-Africanist sense. So it doesn't matter if you're in the Caribbean, the United States, or even on the continent, or anywhere in the world. If you are a person of African lineage, you are African. So talking about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we know you can't mention Dr. King without mentioning Coretta Scott King. Because, you know, in the Pan-African community, we believe in the duality of divine masculine and feminine energy. Just like you can't mention a Nelson Mandela without mentioning a Winnie Mandela, right? So we believe that when we show up, there's always a two-pronged approach, male and female. We're not into any of those type of agenda battles, agenda wars. But if I could, just for a moment, talk about Kanye West. We know Kanye West when he was having his right-wing leanings, where he was simply seeking to ingratiate himself with the white supremacist power structure. He made some very disconcerting, to put it charitably, comments about Queen Warrior Mother, and the great ancestor Harriet Tubman, where he had a ad hoc stump speech at a Washington, D.C. eatery, shout out to Chocolate City, in which he stated that she did not really free the slaves. She simply took us to go work for other white people. Right? We do also know that later, Cardi B, the rapper extraordinaire, as many people would argue, has made some unsavory comments about Coretta Scott King. And then last but not least, this past weekend, I believe, on a podcast, B. Simone, the entertainer, entrepreneur, YouTuber, made some unsavory comments about the late great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in which she was asked a question about what was more important, Dr. King's marital infidelities or him being a leader in the movement. She made a comment. She started off in which she stated that you can't really be a leader in any type of movement if you're not a leader in the home. But then she started made some rather unsavory comments, calling him an ain't shit N-word. I think it's rather problematic. Typically, people say if you don't have anything good to say, you don't say anything good at all, particularly about someone who's passed on. And also someone who's made the contributions that he made to our community. Breaking down barriers such as Jim Crow, segregation, fighting for suffrage, the right to vote, so on and so forth, fair housing, right? So we know that he was involved in a number of fronts, and as we know, he was the eloquent spokesman of the civil rights movement. But also, I think it's very important that when we talk about putting some respect on his name, many people who know me as someone who is a revolutionary Pan-African nationalist, Dr. King and I were on different sides of the streets politically, right? Different sides of the street politically. He was an integrationist. I, of course, was a revolutionary Pan-African nationalist. However, I respected his leadership, his gravitas, his sincerity, and his willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice, right? He made a sacrifice that many of us only talk about, we bloviate about, but we aren't willing to really go all the way to the point that we know we're going to be on the end of a sniper's bullet. And he was willing to do that. So my respect and praise goes out to him 100%, right? To me, he is a martyr for the cause of African redemption at home and abroad, and he has my full and complete respect always. But with that being said, I think it's also important that we highlight that there are a number of other great African ancestors who were ideologically or politically on the other side of the street, but we still give them great respect, particularly Frederick Douglass, right? But with that being said, let's just look at his accomplishments. He was a PhD at the age of 25. 26 years old, he was the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And we put a pin in it real quick when we talk about the Montgomery Improvement Association. And many people always talk about Dr. King was simply about loving everyone and I have a dream. Completely false. I had a chance, of course, many of you know that I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in, of course, Black Studies. And so I had a chance to take a number of African and African American history courses. Excuse me. And so, of course, one of the courses that we took was on the history of the Civil Rights Movement. One of the best books I've ever read about the history of the Civil Rights Movement was Harvey Sitkoff's book, Struggle for Black Equality. And in the book, Dr. King Dr. Sitkoff describes a situation in which Dr. King went to what the power structure, the movers and shakers in Montgomery, the white supremacist power structure in Montgomery, Alabama. And they came back, this is before they started the iconic, revolutionary, historical Montgomery bus boycott that lasted about 13 months. And Dr. King came back from that meeting with the white power structure and told the brothers and sisters in the congregation, this is not about morality. This is an issue of power, right? So Dr. King understood at a very early age, at the very early part of the movement, that, hey, this is about power. It's not about love. It's not about morality. It's about power. He understood that we live in a world in which might is right. Secondly, de facto leader of the Civil Rights Movement, first president of the SCLC, this was a man who made the ultimate sacrifice. I think that's something I'm going to continue to come back to. It's the fact that he made the ultimate sacrifice. So we have to put respect on the name of a man who knew he would become a martyr, like Malcolm X, and was still willing to go all the way, right? Second, I think it's very important that when we think about the Civil Rights and Black Power movement, and it really wasn't that long ago, because we're talking about maybe 60, 70 years ago, really 60-something years ago. My parents were infants during the height of the Civil Rights Movement first started. Many people would argue that it began with, of course, the unfortunate murder of Emmett Till. But when we talk about that, during that time, there was COINTELPRO. We know J. Edgar Hoover created COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, to what? Discredit and disseminate misinformation about Black organizations that were fighting for what? Racial justice, racial redress in America. However, today, because of the proliferation of social media platforms, we have individuals who are disseminating misinformation. I call them agents of confusion. And the reason why I say that is because anytime you have someone who speaks ill of the best amongst us, this is a person who, in my opinion, is a heretic, right? Anyone who will go out and speak, if we as a people were willing to accept that, what does that tell the world about our level of self-respect? And we know the 3 N's of Black Power were self-respect, self-defense, self-determination. And we first have to respect ourselves as African people, respect ourselves as a Black people, and not allow ourselves to engage in what racially disempowering, self-defeating, and self-destructive behavior, right? And we can't, because the reality is, if anyone else, a white person, a Jewish person, a Latino person, an Arab person, an Asian person, spoke ill of Dr. King and said he wasn't really all of that because of X, Y, Z, we would take umbrage with it. We would be ready to go out and protest and march. So we have to be willing to what? Check the people in our community who are disrespecting the best amongst us. Because as I've always stated, we're fighting two enemies. That we know what the external enemy is, right? Racism, white supremacy, the nefarious agents of anti-Blackness globally. But also we have to look at internally, individuals who are doing harm to our community. And I argue that that type of rhetoric does harm because it discredits the great work of Dr. King. Secondly, I think it's also important that if you really want to know what Dr. King was all about, beyond just the rhetoric that the mainstream media pushes about he loved everyone and so on and so forth, I can even recall in his autobiography that I have right here, the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., edited by Claiborne Carson, where he talks about that love without power was sentimental and anemic. Once again, we see that theme of power coming back up again. Many people don't know that in 1967, Dr. King wrote a position paper in which he was supporting Black Power and the Black Power movement, but they won't tell you this, right? So this is why we have to read and study and learn for ourselves. And then last and not least, I think it's very important that when you look at other groups of people, and even though I've always stated that I don't believe that we as a Black people should be looking at other groups of people as a template for how we should behave, but I think it says something to the fact that the reality of the situation is you don't see other groups of people allowing anyone, even people in their own community, to speak ill publicly about their leaders. So a great example would be Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was an ardent racist, right? During the World War II, he openly stated, we're not fighting for the rights and freedoms of our colonial subjects, just the rights and freedoms of white people in Western Europe. He was a drunkard. He was a drinker from can't see in the morning to can't see at night. However, he's praised for his leadership in helping prevent the Nazis from successfully invading England. So that's what he's praised for, right? Mahatma Gandhi, who, of course, during this time in South Africa was known for making numerous anti-black comments, right? So we know he was a racist. He was an anti-black racist, but he's praised and revered for what? His successful struggle against colonialism in India. And even if we want to take it biblical, which we all know how I feel about that, but Noah was accused of drunkenness, but he's remembered for the ark. David slept with Bathsheba, but he's remembered for slaying Goliath. And then last but not least, Solomon had over 700 wives, but he was known for being the wisest man that allegedly ever lived, right? So I think it's just very important that we make sure that we lift up the spirit of our ancestors and we don't allow people to engage in those type of nefarious, anti-black, disempowering rhetoric about them, because it's a reflection of who we are as a people if you're speaking ill about the greatest of our people. So that's all that I really have for now, but just they got to put some respect on Dr. King's name and put respect on all of our ancestors and our great line of divine of radical black resistance to white hegemony. Until next time, you all know what to do. Peace.